Why Vamps Ep22 Shadows of the Past. The chase begins. Arya's mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion as she fled through the crowded streets. The bustling noise of the city was a stark contrast to the silence of her own thoughts, each footstep pounding in her ears like a drum. She darted past vendors and pedestrians, her heart racing, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Behind her, she could sense Daniel's relentless pursuit, his inhuman abilities giving him a terrifying edge. The revelation of Daniel's true nature had shattered Arya's world, and the fear of what he might do now that she knew his secret fueled her desperate flight. She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes wide with terror, catching a glimpse of Daniel weaving effortlessly through the throng of people, his movements a blur of supernatural speed. "Arya, stop!" Daniel's voice carried over the din, but she ignored it, her mind focused solely on escape. She turned sharply down a narrow alleyway, her feet splashing through puddles, the walls closing in around her. The darkness seemed to press against her, and she stumbled, her legs burning with exhaustion. She had no idea where she was going, only that she had to keep moving, had to stay ahead of him. As she emerged from the alley, she found herself in a dimly lit courtyard, the shadows providing a momentary refuge. She pressed herself against the cold stone wall, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. The sounds of the city were distant here, muffled by the high buildings that surrounded her. But there was no time to rest. She knew Daniel was close, his supernatural senses undoubtedly honing in on her location. She scanned the courtyard, her eyes landing on a small wooden door tucked into the corner. With renewed urgency, she sprinted across the courtyard and yanked the door open, slipping inside just as Daniel rounded the corner. The room she entered was dark and musty, filled with forgotten crates and cobwebs. She moved as quietly as she could, her ears straining for any sound of pursuit. For a moment, it seemed as though she might have lost him. But then she heard the door creak open behind her, and her heart sank. "Arya, please." Daniel's voice was closer now, tinged with a desperation that mirrored her own fear. "I just want to talk." Panic surged through her, and she bolted through the room, her hands outstretched to feel her way through the darkness. She found another door at the far end and pushed it open, emerging into another alleyway. The night air was cold against her skin, and she shivered, the adrenaline in her veins the only thing keeping her going. She needed to find sanctuary, somewhere she could hide, somewhere Daniel couldn't reach her. But where? The city was a maze, and she was running out of time. As she stumbled down the alley, her thoughts raced. She remembered a church nearby, its tall spire a familiar landmark. If she could make it there, perhaps she could find refuge within its walls. She turned in the direction she thought the church was, her feet moving on instinct, her mind barely keeping up. Behind her, Daniel's pursuit was unrelenting. She could hear his footsteps now, closer and closer, the sound driving her to push herself harder. The streets blurred around her as she ran, the buildings and lights melding into a dizzying array of colors and shapes. Finally, she saw it, the church, its stone facade illuminated by the soft glow of streetlights. She sprinted towards it, her last reserves of energy propelling her forward. The heavy wooden doors were closed, but she threw herself against them, her fists pounding on the thick wood. "Please, let me in," she cried, her voice breaking with desperation. For a moment, there was no response, and she felt a wave of hopelessness wash over her. But then the door creaked open, and an elderly priest peered out, his eyes widening in surprise. "Child, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice gentle but urgent. "Please, help me," Arya begged, glancing over her shoulder. She could see Daniel now, emerging from the shadows. His eyes locked onto hers with a mixture of determination and regret. The priest nodded and pulled the door open wider, allowing Arya to slip inside. He closed the door just as Daniel reached it, the heavy wood ceiling with a resounding thud. Arya collapsed onto a pew, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The sanctuary of the church enveloped her, its quiet calm a stark contrast to the chaos of her flight. She knew she was not entirely safe, but for now, she had a moment to breathe. A moment to gather her thoughts and prepare for whatever came next. Outside, Daniel stood motionless, his hands resting against the closed door. He didn't try to force his way in, didn't call out to her again. Instead, he simply stood there, his silhouette framed by the dim light of the street, a silent sentinel in the night. Arya watched him through the small window in the door, her emotions a tumultuous storm within her. She felt a pang of sorrow for the man she had once trusted, the man she had loved. But the fear of what he had become, of what he was capable of, overshadowed everything else. As she sat in the quiet stillness of the church, Arya knew that this was not the end of her journey. She would have to find a way to navigate the complex emotions that Daniel's revelation had stirred within her, to reconcile her love for him with the fear and betrayal she now felt. But for tonight, she was safe. And that, she decided, was enough.